Hello, and welcome to the class in Macroeconomics. This is Economics 202, and it's called Introduction or Principles to Economics Principles of Macroeconomics at thousands of colleges and universities around the world and here in the United States. What does macroecon have to do with? What are we going to be studying this semester? So a whole bunch of timely and relevant and common ideas that we'll talk about that make a lot of the news in the papers, and you hear them on blogs and you hear them on nightly news. So it's a class that I think you're going to find relevant, and I think you're going to find some things that interest you and some things that are commonly talked about every day of the week. What's that list of topics? Today I just want to talk about that list of topics and give us an overview of what we're going to study this semester. First of all, macroeconomics has to do with national level economics. So instead of micro, which looks at the individual decision makers, the business firms, and the households, the macroeconomy is going to look at what we call economic aggregates. And an economic aggregate is just a whole bunch of units put together into one. And in this case, we're going to talk about all the households rolled up into a single sector. We're going to talk about all the businesses rolled up into a single sector, and all the government entities rolled up into a single sector, and talk about those big blocks of economic actors and how they get together to form national economic policies and national economic outcomes. Some of the functional areas that we're going to spend a lot of time with are, first of all, national income accounting. And basically, that's adding up what the economy produces and consumes in a given year. And so we're going to rely on that circular flow model, which tells us that businesses produce stuff and households supply inputs into that production process. They earn incomes from producing stuff and subsequently spend those incomes on a flow of goods and services that comes into the household. So we're going to talk about how those sectors get together and some of the motivations for what's produced and how it's produced and how much is purchased ultimately by the consuming households. Another thing that we're going to look a lot at is measuring other things that are commonly in the news. The inflation rate is one thing we'll spend a lot of time with. Inflation basically is just a change in the average price level, and it's a change in the purchasing power of the dollar. And we're interested in that because if we make $1,000 this week, we want to know how much goods and services, how many goods and services we can buy with that $1,000. And I'll tell you from experience, you can buy a lot less with $1,000 now than 35 years ago. And that's the gradual inflation that's gone on over the last 35 or the last 50 years, in fact. Now, interestingly, in the last 55 years, we've only had 2 years, actually in the last 60 years, we've only had 2 years where there's been negative inflation. In 1955 there was, and then again in 2008 or 9, I believe, there was actually a deflation in those years. But for the rest of the time, we've had inflation for every one of those years across that whole series. So inflation is something we want to measure and we want to explain and we want to talk about what causes it and how it affects our economy. We also are very interested in unemployment. We want to know what the unemployment rate is, how it's defined, what unemployment means in terms of the cost that it wreaks on households and societies. We also want to talk about remedies for unemployment. How can we use public policy to reduce the ravages of unemployment? So we want to measure that, and we want to spend a lot of time trying to understand why that changes as economic conditions change. Another thing we'll be very interested in this semester is growth, economic growth. And that just means that as the economy develops, we have a higher output per worker, and therefore we have a higher consumption per household, at least on average, as economics have changed over time. In the classroom, I tell my students, if they want to get a sense of this, to look back at some pictures from your father when he was a kid, or your mother when she was a kid, and look at the house they grew up in, look at the cars, look at the appliances, look at the lack of computers, look at the phones that they used and the roads that they drove on. And if you compare that to today, I think you're going to see an enormous difference. And that enormous difference is really, that's economic growth. It's just higher output per worker translates into higher consumption per household. And we like that because it means that the conditions of scarcity that each one of us faces is a little bit less. Again, we'll talk about measuring growth. We'll talk about why productivity changes, how public policy can make it better or worse, and sort of how other countries of the world have either promoted growth or, in some cases, not grown very much at all. Another interesting feature that we'll deal with this semester is short-run fluctuations in economic activity. And these are called business cycles. And most of you know that the economy comes in cycles. We have boom periods where economic growth is strong, employment is strong, sometimes prices are pushing up, but the economy feels good. It seems to be working well. On the other hand, there are times when the economy seems to be underperforming. People are laid off and businesses are failing and houses are getting foreclosed on. And these kind of conditions are downturns in the macroeconomy, and we want to explain what causes those and if there are any public policy measures that would make those conditions either go away or at least change in a favorable direction. The final big thing that we're going to study is the Federal Reserve and the money supply. And most of you know a little bit about money just from handling it and trading it and dealing with it for your whole life. I know my own kids started to understand money when they were probably 4 or 5 years old, that you could trade this little piece of paper and you could get ice cream for it, and you could get toys, and you could get other things that were useful to you. And it doesn't cost very much to make money. A dollar bill just costs 4 cents to make. A $50 bill similarly just costs 4 cents to make. And so it's probably a little puzzling that you would be able to take this little piece of paper and exchange it for a new computer, or exchange it for a bag of groceries, or exchange it for gallons of gasoline. Why is that? Well, we need to know what money is and how to measure it. We need to know who produces that money, what backs the money. Most of you probably think that's gold, but it really isn't. It's not much at all. It's just the faith that we have that somebody else will accept that when we decide to trade it. So we want to understand that monetary process, and we want to understand the Federal Reserve Board, and they're responsible for printing our money and controlling the supply of money to make sure it doesn't get too out of hand and create an inflationary threat. So those are most of the main themes, most of the themes that we're going to consider this semester in the macroeconomy class. I think you'll find it timely, I think you'll find it interesting, and I'm sure you'll find it relevant to things that you read and talk about every day.